This is The Right Approach. I'm JW Judge, and with me is my co-host, Barbara Hinsky. This is a podcast for writers to learn more about the craft and business of writing as we explore a new topic every week. Our guest today is Savannah Gilbo, who is a certified developmental editor and book coach who helps fiction authors write, edit, and publish stories that work. She is the host of the podcast Fiction Writing Made Easy, where she delivers weekly episodes full of simple, actionable, and step-by-step strategies that you can implement in your writing. And I will tell you, Savannah, I have been listening to your podcast since at least sometime in 2021. So a couple of years now. I love the variety of the kinds of episodes that you put out. Like as we record, last week was kind of a week in the life episode of what you do. But my favorite episodes have been the extensive looks into the first chapters of the Harry Potter books.
Yeah, those are a personal favorite of mine too. And my co-host for those episodes, Abigail K. Perry, we could nerd out about Harry Potter all day. So I'm glad you like those too.
Yeah, and I know how much work it takes to be able to do that particular kind of show. But there's so much value in what y'all did that, at least from my like listening and consuming it perspective, very much appreciated, and there's a lot to pull out of it.
Well, thank you. And thank you guys both for having me today. I'm super excited to nerd out about point of view and writing.
Yeah, that's right. And I want to go ahead and say that folks listening, if you enjoy this episode, and you will, go ahead and queue up episode 29 with Valerie Francis, where we dove into making story theory practical. I think this episode will have very much a similar vibe.
Yeah, and Valerie is a certified editor. We went through the same certification class, so what a fun little nod to the past.
Well, and I will say that I think part of the reason I'm drawn to both of y'all is because of me reading and implementing so much of the story grid and listening to that podcast or those podcasts that were put out through the story grid for so long, and it being such an important part of my process, and having implemented that. And Barb knows and is probably sick of me talking about my spreadsheets that I use, but the framework that I've built is built on the back of the story grid book, and the structure that was created there. And so I know that those processes that are so integral to my writing is what draws me to the podcast that you and Valerie both do. So
yeah,
there's a direct link there.
We're all big story nerds, right? And I remember I've talked to Valerie about this back in the day when we were doing our certification, that we felt similar when we first found the story grid. We were like, this is the missing piece of the puzzle. And like, we're all creatives, right? We have to be creative to write a story, but some of us crave that structure, and the story grid tools can give us that. So big fan as well.
All right, so let's start really broadly with point of view, with what our options are.
Yes. So point of view, to back up even just a microsecond, point of view is how a reader is going to experience your story. So it's the lens through which the reader sees and experiences everything. And within that, you have three main options, but kind of really two main options. So option one is first person. That's like, I walked outside. You're using those I pronouns. Second person is you walked outside. So we're talking to the reader. That one's not as common, unless you remember those choose your own adventure books, which I loved as a kid. And then the third option is third person, and that's he, she, or they, or that character's name walked outside. And then within that option, there are two kind of sub options that we can dig into.
Yeah, and I will say that the only time that I have seen second person used effectively was by N.K. Jemisin. And even then, it was really weird at first, and just like it just takes you a minute. And so it should not be approached by the faint of heart.
Yes, I would say, I know this is kind of spoiling what we're going to get to, but I would say the same for third person omniscient. You can definitely use that, but it's not for the faint of heart because it takes a lot more effort.
And third person omniscient has kind of fallen out of favor, right? I mean, that used to be much more popular than it is now.
Yeah, so you see it in classics like Pride and Prejudice is an omniscient. The book Dune is written in omniscient, which I love that book, but every time I reread it, it is always hard for me to get into because I'm like, wait, what is this? And why am I jumping around between characters? But yeah, it's not as popular because readers want that immediacy and that connection between characters. And omniscient, you're just a little bit removed. So we can talk about that later.
Yeah. Okay. So third person, if we're not going to be omniscient and see into everybody's heads, what are our other options?
Yeah, so the two main options, if I were coaching a writer, I would say I would recommend choosing between first person and third person limited. So within each of these options, you're in one character's head at a time and you're showing the events through that person's perspective. So you're using different pronouns. You're either saying I did this or he, she, they did that, right? But we're in their head experiencing one scene through one character's head at a time. You can have multiple first person or third person limited narrators, but we want to stick to one character per scene just because it helps with that immediacy. It helps us structure things and makes your life as a writer a lot easier.
Can I ask, when you coach your people, and I work with a writing coach who was my developmental editor, and I think it's the best way to be most productive. It's genius. I love it. So I recommend people to, I know we're not here to talk about your services that way, but I think they'd be great. Okay. So do you try and coach people not to use too many point of view characters in a book?
I
'Cause
do.
that-
Yeah, I do generally, especially if it's their first book, I say let's at least try to just stick to one for at least your first draft or until we come up with a compelling reason why we should have a second or third or whatever it is. Because some stories, like let's say you're writing a dual point of view love story, that makes a little more
Right.
sense why we might want to have a second point of view character. But if you're writing something like I see this in fantasy a lot, let's say young adult fantasy, and the writer, because I'll always back up and say, okay, well, why do we want to use more than one point of view? Like, what do we think that's going to accomplish? And most of the time it's, well, I need to deliver all of this information and I need to show all of this stuff from all around the world. And it's like, okay, but that's not going to help you create the most compelling story. You're just going to use it to dump information, which is not ideal. So usually we'll kind of unwind things like that. And then if that is the reason, we say, okay, let's pretend that you have the skills to deliver a compelling story through one point of view. How would you feel about that? And they're like, well, great. I would love that. I just don't think I could do it. So sometimes we make point of view choices based on insecurity. And I don't think that's the best way to go. I don't know if you guys have ever felt something like that, where you're kind of like, oh, this feels easier to use like 10 points of view. But then you end up writing the story and you're like, what the heck is this? It's happened to me.
Yeah, it's confusing. And I read personally on audiobooks a lot.
Yeah.
And most of the narrators are good about at least giving you at the start of a chapter the point of view character's name, but not always. And it's more confusing. So as I think about, writing books that are enjoyed and saleable, I think you tie your hands behind your back if you just jump all over the place in audio. You want to be careful with that.
Right. And the more things you try to do, the harder it's just going to be. So, I always say if you're willing to know it's going to be hard work and you want to do it anyway, that's great. But if you're starting out and this is going to be your first novel and you still need to learn what does it mean to write a scene, or how do you connect that link of cause and effect between your scenes, just kind of the fundamentals, make your life easier because you have a big learning curve in front of you to start and finish a novel. And then once you get to the end, you're either going to convince yourself, I really do need that second point of view because now I've seen my full draft. Or what was I thinking? I don't need that second point of view. The story's great as is. So when in doubt, keep it easy because writing's hard enough, right?
Yeah. So what are some of the pros and cons in choosing between first person and third person limited?
Yeah. So it's funny because I tell the writers I work with, I believe a lot of it is personal preference because third person limited in theory is going to achieve the same things as first person. You're going to be close to the character. You're going to get their interiority, so their thoughts and feelings and how they're subjectively interpreting what's happening. Like we said, the pronouns are going to be different, right? The I versus the he, she, they, or name. You can pull off plot twists and surprises with both of them. That's always a big concern. With both options, you're going to have you're going to be limited with what you can show the reader because we're only seeing it from that character's perspective, right? The only thing I would say with third person limited is you can zoom out just a little if you want and need to. So in the Harry Potter books, since we talked about those first chapters, if you think about the very first chapter of the very first book where we kind of see Dumbledore, we see Harry get dropped off at Privet Drive, right? So we're kind of zoomed out a little more than we are in the rest of the book where we more closely follow Harry. So it lets you do things like that. Or even, let's say, I'm going to make this up, but let's say we're in the scene where Harry gets sorted and we're in his head. And then at the end of the scene, the writer wants to zoom out just a little bit, and talk about, little did he know that, tomorrow was going to be even harder. You can do that with third person limited more than first person.
What do you find? Because certain genres are really first person heavy. I personally don't like reading first person all that much. I get tired of it. But it seems like, chick lit is one, for example. So when you're working with a writer who's in a genre that's really heavily first person, do you coach them to go that way, or?
Yeah. So like, for example, young adult tends to be written in a lot of first person, like the Hunger Games is first person. And for everything, I always like to back out and think about why is that being done? And it's done because those characters want that sense of immediacy and they want to be in the character's skin. Right. So after that, so let's say I'm working with you and you're writing young adult. I would say, okay, most of the books in the young adult category are written in first person. How do you feel about that? If you feel great, then you green light, right? Let's start writing. If you're like, oh, I really like third, then we can say, okay, it's fine. It's not the most common, but it's fine. We just need to make sure we establish that immediacy and that closeness because that's really what readers want. So I don't know. I personally, I read a lot of young adult and I read a lot of adult fantasy and I'm kind of all over the map. I feel like there's a lot more blending or a lot more like third person creeping into young adult than there used to be. I've even seen some young adult books, fantasy romance books that have like a first person, one point of view, and then a third person and another point of view. So I don't know, it's interesting.
Yeah.
So Barb says she doesn't like first person. Within a few days I just sent her the manuscript of a book that I finished that's in first person. So I'm going to go crawl under my desk here.
No, I've read the first pages and I love that. And I write a first person character. I've got a character with a guide dog in it.
Oh, I love it.
I write from his short little chapters first person because it can be so much more charming.
Yeah.
And to get his, sarcastic, sardonic little views on things. Right. But no, I know I'm going to love your book, Jeremy.
All right. So
no crawling under the desk.
Yeah. My first 4 novels were all third person limited. Well, I said the first 4 that I finished anyway. Yeah. The first 3 were multiple points of view. The 4th one was single point of view, but this last one is first person. And it was such a different experience communicating those interior thoughts of the viewpoint character in first person than it was even in third person. In third person, like that 4th novel it was just one character, but it was third person. And you put it in italics to show the thoughts that they're thinking but not expressing, and you don't want to put he thought that whatever, so you just put it in italics. And in some ways I found that easier than communicating the thoughts of my narrator and point of view character in the other novel. And that was not at all the experience I expected to have.
Yeah. And I think that's interesting because having worked with so many writers, I do think it kind of boils down to just personal. There's going to be one thing that works like that for most people. or for different people. So personally, I love writing in third person. I don't mind writing in first person. I just happen to like reading and writing third more. But I do also find that it depends on the type of person you are too. So if you're someone that likes to overthink and dig into your emotions and feel the emotions, you might feel naturally drawn to first person because it's kind of how you think, right? If you're not, I don't want to say like neither of these options is negative, but if you're not someone who likes to think about emotions or feel things strongly, you might be drawn more to third person, even though we're still going to want to see those emotions in third person. So I tend to see it depends too on the type of person, which lane they'll pick.
Yeah, and we've talked about it on here before. I am not well, I was going to say I'm not an emotionally driven person, but I mean, I guess we all are that. Maybe I'm not an emotionally driven writer because that's the thing I always have to go back in and add more depth to. But, the other thing that was different for me in writing first person was that, and this is going to sound like super glaringly obvious, but everything is exhibiting that narrator, that point of view character. The whole thing is their personality.
Right.
As opposed to in third person, so much of it is still me coloring the story and deciding how it's going to be told. And I think that was part of me figuring out how to incorporate their thoughts in that first person story from a natural way to do it, because all of it is their thoughts. And so it's just such a different kind of storytelling. I really enjoyed it, but I didn't find that it made it easier or harder. I mean, I guess it was harder in that I was learning how to tell a story in a different manner, but not like objectively harder, just subjectively, because that wasn't my experience.
Right. And I think it's interesting, like a thought experiment, because if, let's say, like, what genre do you write in?
Well, so the first four were all fantasy, and then and then this fifth one that I just finished is a suspense, murder, mystery, thriller kind of story.
So now imagine if you were to decide to write a romance novel, you're going to have a similar experience where it's kind of like, I've never done this before. I understand the mechanics, but it's either easier or harder. Right. And I like talking about this stuff because I feel like sometimes if a writer tries something and let's say does what you did, where they change points of view and they're like, I'm going to decide to write in third person, and maybe it's harder. Right. And then they think something's wrong with me because I don't get it, when it's really like nothing's wrong with you. You just prefer first person. It's okay. I think sometimes we're really hard on ourselves as writers about these types of things.
Absolutely.
No doubt. Well, and another thing that I have done that maybe isn't the best thing to do is all of my books have been very different kinds of stories. And so, like the first book was really urban fantasy, dark fantasy kind of story, and then the second, it was also fantasy, but there was a serial killer and a crime element. And then the third one was action adventure. And so none of the stories have been the same type of story and had the same type of requirements. And I think I enjoy the differences, but it has also made it more difficult to self-inflicted, more difficult to tell different kinds of stories each time, instead of, this is the thing I write and I'm going to stick to it for a while and learn all of its various nuances. I've been bouncing around. And so, that may not be ideal either.
Well, there is something kind of cool. Go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, I think all of your writing, from my observation, and I'm not qualified like you are, but it all is fast paced. All of them are page turners, and all of them, whether you call it fantasy, dark fantasy, whatever, crime, they all have a little bit of mystery to them or suspense or something to them. But you write page turners, and that's a real good common link between all of them, I think. Do you think I'm wrong about that, Jeremy?
No, I think that's accurate.
Yeah.
And that, I am not heavy on exposition. And so there's a lot of dialogue, and that's what moves the stories. And there's not any single page in any of my books that I think a single paragraph takes up, more than a third of the page. So that, yeah, I'm
Yeah.
with you there. So Savannah, let me ask you this. Is there talking about reader expectations, and now a lot of readers want fast-paced stories. Um, you know, we had on one of our early guests was David Ellis, who co-wrote books with James Patterson and writes thrillers. And, they talked about having their goal is 1,200 word chapters because it moves the story along so quickly. Are there points of view that help achieve that kind of storytelling more effectively than others, or you can do it however you want to tell that story, you can get it done?
Yeah, I think however you want to tell it, you can get that done. And I like the idea of, having that sweet spot, whether it's 1,000 or 1,200, whatever you want. You can also write longer scenes, let's say 1,500 words, and then break the chapters or break the scenes into chapters so that you're having chapters that are smaller word counts, but you still have that full scene. So yeah, I think there's a lot of techniques you can use. I wouldn't say that point of view is going to point you in one direction or the other. I think you can do it in any one you choose. Because like you said earlier, what really slows stuff down is that exposition. So, you can go nuts with that in any point of view and make it slow.
So, Barb, I feel like I've been talking this whole time. If you've got anything, then just jump in.
I just
You're my
enjoyed this because, point of view is such a big decision, and it's really helpful to get it right when you start writing, because rewriting to fix it is a chore and a half. And I agree that the best advice for beginning writers is pick an easy one. Pick one of the easy ones and go with that, and get fancy later if you decide you want to make yourself do that. It's hard enough to write a book.
Yeah, so in this fifth novel, I started out writing it in third person, and I thought that it was going to be a multiple point of view book. It's a murder mystery about this group of people that get stuck on this desolate island. And I wrote about 11 chapters into it before I realized this needs to be first person, and it needs to be told from the same person's point of view, because if I do it this other way, then what I'm going to end up doing unintentionally is choosing which characters tell the story and playing hide the ball with the reader, because I don't want to give away the mystery. And so I'm going to be intentionally choosing people who don't know all the components of the story. Whereas if I write it from just one person and it's, their viewpoint, they're telling this story, the reader can only know what they know, and it won't feel disingenuous. And so I wish that I had arrived at that before I had written, 10,000 words or whatever it was. But I went back and made that change because I felt like it's best served the story.
Yeah. I'll say too, something I see a lot is that writers tend to make things really complicated because they think things like a fancy point of view or like a strange choice for their point of view is going to make their story interesting. And it can, but it's not the thing that makes a story interesting. So, if there's a writer out there who's like, I'm going to, I see this a lot where people don't want to use dialogue tags and they don't want to use quotations just because they think that's going to make them stand out. And it's like, no, it's going to make your story unreadable, So I think for everyone, I would say just keep it in mind that sometimes simpler is better, and then learn how to maximize what you've written, So, and like, I like your thought process where you're like, I don't want to be disingenuous. I'm not going for the gimmick of like, let me dangle a carrot in front of you for 12 chapters and make you upset.
Yeah.
You're like, I want to tell a good story and I want to do it in an artful way. So I think that's great.
Yeah, very few of us are going to be, Cormac McCarthy or E.E. Cummings and be able to get away with doing strange things. So you're better off doing the thing. So one of the things I learned about when I started blogging and really paying attention to writing and, copywriting principles and that sort of thing way back in, it was like 7 years ago now, was that you want to cause the reader to burn as fewer mental calories as possible and keep them in the story. Don't do things that don't serve the story. And, I think that goes really well, Savannah, with what you were just saying of the gimmicks. They don't serve the reader. They don't keep the reader interested. And if you're a writer and you want to sell books, that's the thing, is keep the reader in the story, keep them from putting the book down, and don't do things that are going to confuse them or, make them have to go figure out what you're saying or who's saying it or where it's coming from.
Right. And I read a draft recently, and I've talked about this on my podcast, so I'm not going to upset anybody by sharing this, but I read a draft where the character is, every few sentences, they're reminding you that they're a liar and like nothing that they say is true, possibly. And so as I was reading it, I'm like, well, then why do I care about any of this,
Mhm.
And the writer was like, well, I want this to be an unreliable narrator. And I'm like, okay, I get the intention, but this is not the way to do it. And it as a reader, it discredited kind of the whole story. And so I think a lot of us, we want to do these kinds of things, but we get in our heads and we don't think about the reader at the end of it, because when I backed up and I'm like, well, how would you feel if you were reading a book and the character's telling you that maybe none of what you're reading is true? And she's like, yeah, I think I might feel like I'm wasting my time.
Yeah, absolutely. I hate the unreliable narrator.
Yeah.
Hate it. I know it's been usually popular, but no.
I don't mind it if it's done, well, and it's not like so in your face. I like it as like that one line at the end where you're like, wait a minute, was I fooled? But yeah, I think simpler is just always better for a lot of writing things.
Yeah, and that's why I have 2 novels that are still unfinished, is because I figured out during the writing of them, I don't know how to execute these stories yet.
Yeah.
And there was nothing particularly overly complicated about them. I just didn't know how to write a novel. And that's so much of this is trial and error. And like you said earlier, we've got to be able to give ourselves a break because it's okay if you mess it up. Because the thing about writing is, like, until it's published out in the world, it can always be fixed and you can always learn how to do it better. And if that means that the story that you're working on, you can't execute that story, it's not a waste. You still
Right.
have all of that learning that has occurred about storytelling and just the process of doing it over and over and over. And you're going to get better and you're going to be intentional about what you're learning. And it's okay. If
Yeah.
this story doesn't work, put it down. If there's another one that will.
Yeah. And I don't know if you guys find this, but I see writers who they're like, I have these 2 different ideas and they're really excited about one, but it's very complex or it needs like 3 point of view characters or whatever. And then they have this other one that they also kind of light up about. And they're like, it's just one point of view. It's like a fun romance. I'm excited to write it. And I'm like, great, that's your learning book. It's easier, write that one, learn the craft, and then you'll know when you're ready to tackle the monster.
Yes.
But yeah, and the other thing too, with so many storytelling decisions, sometimes you don't know what to do as you're in the middle of a draft. You have to get to the end, even if it's like a messy or skeleton draft or whatever that is, to know what needs to be done. And I think the worst thing that a writer can do is get stuck on a decision like point of view. Because imagine if you had gotten stuck on that story and you're like, I'll just wait until the right point of view reveals itself. And I'm not going to write anything else because I want to write this one. You would probably still be waiting.
Mhm.
Yes.
I totally agree. Well, we are about out of time. But before we go, I want to make sure people know where to find you and follow you, the work that you're doing, so that they can hear more of your ideas about storytelling and craft and theory and learning how to be a better writer.
Sure. So my website is just savannahgilbo.com, and you can find links to my social media and my podcast. Since we're on the topic of point of view, I will recommend a few episodes. If you just search interiority on my website or in the podcast app, you'll find, I believe at this point, there's 3 different ones, and interiority relates to point of view. So it'd be a good companion piece to this episode today.
All right. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you guys for having me. This was really fun.